Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webcast, Optimizing Microsoft Teams Voice when returning to the office only complicates things. I'm your host, Microsoft MVP, Nick Cavalancia, and I'm joined today by Rob Doucette. He's the VP of Product Development over at Martello. Rob, thanks for joining me again. We've done a couple of these together.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Glad to be here.
Yeah, as always, should be fun. If you've been on any of these webcasts before, so a relatively informal kind of webcast. We've got a couple of slides. We do a little bit of discussion back and forth. The hope is to try and kind of zone in on this issue of extending out Teams voice when now you're trying to add in PBXs and SBCs, and you're trying to basically integrate your users that are utilizing traditional legacy phone products with Teams, and how do we accomplish that? And so our agenda today is relatively simple. I want to talk first about the problem of why mixing Teams with those legacy products can be a challenge here. I want to talk about the main points of failure when it comes to utilizing what I'm just sort of overgeneralizing as the public switch telephone network, as a supply chain, if you will, meaning all of those parts that now have to plug into Teams. Then we'll talk about what aspects of Teams can be monitored to provide some degree of visibility and insight into understanding where the problem is, and then maybe even what the problem is and how to solve it. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps and some Q&A. And before we do that, I do have a couple of polls that I'm going to put up here. I got two of them. And the design for this is just to kind of get a sense of the audience so we can somewhat tailor our conversation to what your needs are. So I'm going to put these up here, and if you go ahead and interact with the screen and just tell us what your answer is, I'm going to go ahead and push the first poll out. And you can see here it says, are you currently using PSTN connectivity with Teams? You got a couple of options there. You see with yes, with calling plans, with direct routing. Rob and I were just talking about how more and more folks are starting to use Operator Connect. Maybe no, you're planning on doing it very soon, and then you have no plans at all. And while we're waiting for our audience to kind of interact with that poll, Rob, based on just experience with customers, what are you expecting to see as the answer here?
Yeah, I would expect to see the majority land in direct routing. That does seem to be the more popular option, at least what we're hearing from prospects and customers over calling plans. To your point, I think Operator Connect, it's still in public preview, so it's early in its life cycle, but I think we are getting a lot of attention there. But I think for what people are doing today, I would expect to see direct routing take the majority here.
Looks like we've got about half of you who voted. I'm going to wait another 5-10 seconds or something. Just let these come in real quick. Make sure we don't cut anybody off. Wait, I was going to vote. Don't want to do that to you. That's not the point. But here, I'm going to go ahead and close this out now that we got about half of you, just so we can see the results here. So we can keep going again. We don't have too much time today. But you're kind of spot on, Rob. You got 33% with direct routing. No one's using Operator Connect yet, which is okay. And it looks like some of you are either planning, almost half of you, or more than half of you, are planning to utilize Teams integration with PSTN connectivity and so on. And then there's some of you with no plans, but obviously you're maybe considering or something along those lines, at least informally, because you're on the call today. So let's jump to the second one, and we'll hide those results here. And the second one is somewhat related here, but again, interact with the screen. Which of the following components does your IT team monitor for Teams performance and availability problems? And you can see you've got a couple of factors here that come into play: endpoints, the networks you might have internally, the Microsoft Office 365 networks, your ISP, VPN usage, cloud proxies, SIP trunks, SBC vendors, meeting rooms specifically, that kind of thing. So go ahead and interact with the screen. It says right now that it's still distributing the poll. I know that Rob, traditionally Martello is focused on everything that's sort of in the list before this new direct routing and Operator Connect and so on feature sets within Teams. So what are you kind of expecting to see here?
Yeah, I think, based on the previous question, right, I think those who did say, yes with direct routing, I suspect the SIP trunks or SBC vendors is a blind spot for a lot of organizations. But I think more broadly, I would also expect the user endpoints or networks to be a big blind spot. That's something that obviously has changed in the last 18 months or so, where I described this as, pre-pandemic, we might have had thousands of employees working in a handful of offices. That quickly morphed into thousands of employees in thousands of unique offices, which, created a lot of challenges for IT. So be interested to see how many fall into that bucket.
Yeah, wonderful. We're again right around 47, 48, 49%. We're getting there. So I'm going to go out to close this in a moment here once you get to about half of you. And that way we can kind of see some results here. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that and put these results out. And you're kind of spot on. It's the endpoints, the internal networks, Office when we can, You can see that there's still some use of monitoring ISPs. I know that's kind of difficult for some, so that's why I'm assuming it's 9%. You can see an even smaller percentage doing meeting rooms, and there is some use of monitoring your SIP trunks, SBC vendors, and that sort of thing as well in here. Rob, any surprise from these results, really, as you think about it?
No, not really. That's pretty consistent with what I expected. Maybe the office networks is a bit higher than I expected, but a lot of organizations are implementing return to office plans, so that's probably understandable.
Yep, it makes sense. So let's jump into the agenda here. I'm going to go ahead and put up on the screen. The first topic we're going to talk about is just the challenge here. And it's interesting, Rob, you mentioned just sort of the changes that have happened over the last 14 months or so, 16 months around what connectivity looks like, where people physically are, those kinds of things. You kind of alluded to some of that, and everyone obviously in the audience knows this kind of thing. And the reality is this mix of taking Teams and PBXs, PSTNs, and all the other hardware services that go along with it, there's some real similarity there in terms of that and what's involved with switching from what was once a static environment. Everyone's in the office, they're utilizing the same network, to suddenly a wide range of connectivity methodologies, routing paths, which devices they're using, how they're connecting to the internet, all that kind of thing. And when we're thinking about Teams on its own, it already has a lot of, it's multifaceted in a lot of ways. If you think about this, most of you who are, hopefully you're not new to Teams, you already know that it involves a number of different services under the hood. There isn't really there's proportionally a Teams service, but underneath you've got OneDrive, you've got SharePoint, you've got Exchange. There's a lot of different facets within Office 365 or the Microsoft 365 platform that in sum total make up Teams. So there's a ton of different networks that are being used, services, servers, applications, just on the Microsoft side alone. And then there's lots of points of failure, even down to something like, let's say, authentication to Azure AD, that could be the problem. That's keeping someone from getting to Teams. But of course, the help desk ticket's just going to say, I can't get into Teams, which isn't really helpful. But that's the idea of why it's so multifaceted. But then you start adding in phone functionality, telephony, legacy telephony functionality. It's certainly going to add a tremendous amount of value because you're now having these hybrid environments where some people are at home, but some people are still in the office. And it makes sense that we want to have those people not have to change the way they work because they're used to grabbing that handset, put up to their ear, or maybe they got a headset on, they press the button to enable the line. But the whole point being, they should work the same way they always have, if that's the case, and we want to allow them to do so. But doing so also adds a level of complexity because now we're mixing a very modern, cutting edge, moving at a very fast pace, rate of change kind of Teams technology with legacy technology that hasn't been probably changed in a number of years, potentially for your organization, and certainly in general hasn't changed a lot in a bit of time as well. And there's a lot of components that come into play here. I need to kind of walk through all these with you, but the idea being here that there are a lot of components. Some cases like the direct routing, there's actually a Teams component. There's a service that's in there. There's a whole configuration that's involved, making sure that's correct. But then you have the carriers, you have the SIP trunks, you have the SBCs, you have the legacy hardware, just everything else that goes in there where you don't have control over it. Which usually, when you think about, like we always talked about going to the cloud in general over the last 10 years, there's always kind of two things you always lose when you move something to the cloud, and that's visibility and control. And in the same way, when we're adding to this complexity by bringing in this legacy technology, you're adding in something that someone else, another vendor owns. And there's some real similarities there where you're losing potentially visibility and certainly control, although you never really had the control there. And so that's really kind of the bottom line here is there's a lot more of this now when you're trying to make sure that you have the connectivity. It's not necessarily in your control. In fact, it's probably less in your control. And so, Rob, I've got a question I was writing down. I was thinking about this as I built this slide here. And we've done a couple of these webcasts together, and we've talked about how complex Teams is just on its own, and the resulting difficulty that's involved in identifying just the source of a Teams problem. Like I mentioned, it could be Azure AD doing authentication, and that's the problem, or it might be a connectivity issue, or it might just be actually an internal routing issue within the organization. And so the question I'm thinking about is, how much more complex does this become, like with utilizing direct routing with Teams? How much more complex does it make when you're doing those two together?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly taking something that, as you just described, is already fairly complex and just pushed it even further down that spectrum, right? We already know that especially with organizations where people might still be at home, You've got, the ISP performance, you have the local network performance, you have the endpoint. Is there a VPN in play where you're using a VPN to get into your office that you should be breaking the traffic out first? And, so that was already pretty complex. And now we've added, SIP trunk capacity, and we've added third-party SBC vendors and carriers in play. And so it's just a few extra pieces of the puzzle that, to the most part, a lot of organizations don't have a lot of control and visibility over. So it's certainly making things pretty complex.
Yeah, no, I would agree here, and I want to kind of jump into the next slide only because I think it helps make that complexity a little more clear for you guys in the audience. When you think about the main points of failure, where something can kind of go wrong, some of this is all kind of very basic blocking and tackling, and some of this stuff some of you in the audience may even know already, and that's okay, because I really see these webcasts as being not so much that this is going to provide you with eye-opening, oh my gosh, I never knew that, but more so really an opportunity to focus on the topic for a period of time, in this case about a half an hour or so that we have, and just kind of figure out, listen to us and think about from a perspective of how you're going to solve this problem. And so I grabbed this screenshot right from Microsoft's website. So this is really kind of paints the picture of, on the left hand side, you got Microsoft 365, you of course have Teams users, there's a phone system as well involved that kind of ties back over to your on-premises solutions you have there in the middle, with a number of different solutions. Might be a session a border controller, which of course is going to be helpful there for doing like some of your security, going to be helpful for doing some of the SIP data as well, helping with your quality of service, that kind of thing, your third-party PBX, telephony equipment, and so on. And then over on the far right is the old, I was going to say PTSD. That was the wrong four-letter acronym. PSTN, of actually going out and making phone calls. And so when you look at this and you think about it this way, I'm going to kind of walk through this here. You put aside Teams for the moment, where it already has its own complexities that Rob kind of just talked about in the last slide a little bit, but then you do have that session border controller. And the big thing that I really want to point out is that idea of that it's providing quality of service. It provides, of course, other things, but it's really trying to make sure that that there is a real good quality as it's handing over the conversation between basically what's digital and VoIP, if you will, over to a physical kind of telephony type environment here. Then you of course got the PBXs, you have your switching station there as well. You see you have your PSTN that's in there, but then there's still issues like Rob mentioned, like the connectivity that exists, where those first two things that are kind of working on behalf of your physical legacy telephony equipment and services might be working flawlessly. The problem might actually be that the users at home connected through Teams and their kids happen to be on playing Xbox or something at the same time, sucking up all of the bandwidth. And that's actually the cause of the problem. So there's connectivity issues that could be in there, how this is configured, how the direct routing is configured, somebody that might be using Operator Connect, how that's configured as well. And then just the routing of calls as well, making sure they actually get to the right spot. I mean, Rob, what are you seeing with prospects? And a couple of questions I was thinking about here. When you talk to prospects and customers, where are the points of failure? Is it something here that's primarily responsible on the right hand side? Is it something else that I haven't mentioned?
No, I think you've covered them well. I think for those that have already moved into PSTN connectivity in Teams, I think they've quickly discovered that there are a few things that they don't have great visibility into, whether that's the performance of your SIP trunks or the performance of your SBC provider, handset, headset, endpoint performance. Quite a bit on top of all the other things that you just talked about, like connectivity, the complexity of Teams, including a lot of the other components from Microsoft 365 to work in tandem. So there's a lot of moving parts here. Without PSTN connectivity, it just gets worse when you or gets more challenging, I should say, as you add PSTN connectivity on top of this.
Yeah, you mentioned visibility. How much does a lack of visibility come into play when trying to solve these problems?
It's probably the number one pain point that we hear from prospects and customers, where they may have a basic understanding of where the problem spots are. Oftentimes they don't even have that if people aren't calling. So Nick is calling the help desk complaining about poor Teams performance. Okay, we know Nick has a problem, but we have no idea why, right? We have to spend time with Nick. We don't have the right tools to understand what does Nick's path to the Microsoft data center look like? What is his endpoint performance? Are there other people, as you said, in Nick's home or office consuming bandwidth? There are a lot of factors, and it's a very, very painful exercise to go through when it's not an office network. That's something that's fairly well tuned and well understood. But when you've got hundreds or thousands of people in unique home offices, this gets unmanageable very quickly.
It's interesting you say that because I know we've done in a couple of webcasts before and just laid out examples of like Microsoft recommendation for teams in general is to go directly from the user to teams. Like, don't route through the organization's network, don't utilize security solutions, that kind of thing. But as most organizations are sort of doing today, they might be using VPNs, so therefore you're going into the office and they don't have those configured properly so that office traffic goes directly to teams. And then if you think about it, for those in the audience, you think about even if you were to go through the office, you have a user going from sort of their house to a VPN to the corporate office, routing through the corporate network, finally up to Microsoft Teams. Then that Teams call is going basically back to the corporate office through a session border controller, eventually the telephony equipment, and then out to the PSTN. That's a really complex route. And that visibility to understand exactly both how that's configured, which goes back to the idea of configurations being wrong, and or where in that chain is a problem, is what makes the visibility so important and why this is such a challenge here. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about monitoring Teams voice. And the goal, of course, is you want to increase visibility, you want to increase insight into understanding where the problem is, so therefore you can try to solve it. And then you reduce your mean time to remediation, you improve service quality of that particular service, reduce help desk calls, lower the total cost of ownership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole Teams, kind of thing here. You can see on the left here, I've got Teams, and then I have on-premises and carrier. And on Teams, I kind of left some things already up there because we've had a bunch of other webcasts Rob and I have done together where we've talked about these things where you have the ability to monitor whether it's maybe doing some stuff, maybe with some PowerShell or utilizing solutions from Martello or other vendors where you can monitor the call quality. You can look at service availability. You can look at the performance of the Teams services and even the underlying services like as Exchange App, as OneDrive App, as Azure AD App, all those kinds of things, and seeing the performance of those services. And then also the network path routing. So there's lots of visibility in Teams that actually has been around for some time. It's not something that's brand new today or been out in the last 6 months. It's been around for a while. And initially I was going to try and build like an on-premises column and then a carrier column. And I realized there's really a lot of crossover. And so I really just kind of crossed the two together. And there is an opportunity for you, and this is some of the areas you should be thinking about, how do I monitor this? Because that's really what the focus is going to be, is looking at call failures, looking at poor call quality. Those kinds of things are going to help give you an idea, especially when you know where someone is or how they're configured to do calls within Teams. You can determine whether it's an on-premises issue, even determine if it's a particular carrier problem from a perspective of like everybody that's on carrier A is having a problem, but everyone carrier B is not. Maybe by process of elimination, you can help determine whether the carrier is having a problem or if it's something with on-premises because it's everybody in the New York office, those kinds of things. Same thing with jitter, packet loss, latency, the normal things you look with calls. And then, by looking at where the user is, who the user is, what device they're on, what client they're using, where their location is, whether they're at home, they're in a particular part of the country, they're in a particular office, who the ISP is, these kinds of functionality, these kind of, criteria can all help isolate down where the problem is. And so in a lot of ways, monitoring Teams voice ends up being less about, I need to monitor the status of the PBX, which probably isn't capable of doing that because the PBX is 10 years old, that came out before Teams, and there's no APIs, and Microsoft certainly isn't going to try and make an ability to try and interact with every PBX in the planet, that kind of thing. So it becomes more of an idea of trying to isolate down where the problem is and what is consistent about those that are having the problem, and then also looking at the type of call that it is and trying to see that to help again isolate this down. So Rob, let's talk a little bit about it. And again, I got a couple questions here for you. Let's talk about why we're not using like PSTN, SBC, or PBX specific metrics. I mean, I kind of outlined it a little bit, but maybe you can dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I think it first comes back to trying to get visibility into those metrics to start with, which is already a big enough challenge. There's a few tools that have been provided by Microsoft. Don't quite give you everything that you need. It's a start, but and to your point, it's not like there's a Microsoft PBX that's used with all the Teams configurations. There's a number of providers out there, whether it's Audio Codes, Oracle, Acme, Ribbon, lots of different flavors within that. And lots of different configurations within that, even between calling plans and direct routing, for example, have different architectures. So, it's it might sound simple, like, oh, I just need a couple of metrics to understand what's going on, but it's, I think people realize it's an uphill battle very quickly.
Yeah, and it's far more complex because it really does involve monitoring all the stuff that I've got on here. So would you walk the audience through maybe an example of how utilizing this level of visibility and monitoring that I'm kind of outlining here on the screen will improve their ability to see where the problem is, maybe what the root cause is, and then maybe even have some insight into solving the problem?
Yeah, so I mean, the first step, we find prospects, as I mentioned earlier, are challenged just understanding where are the problems in my organization, right? Even for a small, medium-sized organization, this is a challenge. You can imagine this is an enormous challenge for some of the larger enterprises in the world, right? They don't even know where the problem is, right? Who are having problems with teams? We don't know. We know that most people don't, reach into their help desk system and create a nice little ticket that explains their poor experience with teams. They just suffer in silence. They try and fix the problem themselves. They lean on their peers and try and get them to help them. And all this is just sapping productivity of the company because they're not actually using teams to be productive. They're just going in circles trying to fix the problem. So, just starting there is a big step forward. Like, what's happening across the organization? Where should I prioritize my efforts and spend my time? And then you quickly run into the challenge that we've been describing in the previous slides is, okay, now I know, let's say Nick is having trouble. Well, why? What's the bottleneck with Nick's experience? And then we're back to the, is it his ISP? Is it his local network? Is he using a VPN where he shouldn't be breaking out, where he should be breaking out the traffic? So it's a complex problem, but first we got to start with at least understanding at the very top level, what does call quality look like across the organization? That's going to give us the idea of this, service availability that you just talked about. And here's a screenshot that we have included that sort of shows what we're able to do with Martello solution to give you that top level picture. What's going on in the organization? Where are my hotspots? Where should I prioritize my efforts? Right? If there's 100 people having problems in my Paris office, and only the rest are kind of scattered around the world, well, maybe I'll start with Paris first because those efforts are going to have a larger reward associated to it, getting those employees being productive and not complaining and leaning on each other trying to solve their own problems. And this is one example from our flexible dashboarding system where we can slice and dice this in a number of different ways depending on what the organization is looking at. But this example that we put together just highlights specifically for PSTN calls happening in the organization, where are their problems being either failed calls or poor performing calls, and start identifying where I should spend my time. And then, I talked about the next step, right? Okay, so now we sort of have that top level view, where are my challenges? We need a little bit more data than just, there's problems in Paris. So now we can get into the details of our analytics engine and start looking at, what sort of problems are people in Paris having? And so I put up an example here, redacted for the Martello employees so they don't get exposed here. But we can see they are making some PSTN calls. We get quite a bit of data here, and I should call out this is a completely agentless approach, so I don't have to deploy anything to this user's device to try and get this level of detail. This does come out of the Microsoft tenant, combination of call quality data and their graph APIs. And we can see what was the performance like. Where did they go? What type of call happened? How did it end? And we'll generate an alert for each of these experiences to alert IT. Even if Nick decides not to call and just suffer in silence, IT knows it's happening and can decide, do I need to step in here because we see that Nick's had 17 bad calls today. It's probably having a drag on his performance and his satisfaction working at this company. So let's reach out and try and make him a little happier. And then, I mentioned there's, all this stuff between Nick and the cloud. So what does the network route look like, right? How do I now take that action of I need to fix Nick's problem to actually implementing that and giving, some actionable insights that I can move on. And this is where we need to identify the bottlenecks. So we need to understand, what's happening between this example. We're using Greg, not Nick, but Greg's home and the Microsoft Teams data center. As we've sort of set the stage through the earlier slides in this presentation, there's a lot of stuff that's potentially between Greg and Microsoft, whether those VPNs, cloud proxies, ISP performance, Microsoft front door locations, all those things have to work in tandem for Greg to get a good experience. So using the diagnostics capabilities, I can quickly see here that I've got a pretty significant issue with Greg, and I can see in the bottom right here, we can give you a breakdown of latency, jitter, and packet loss across that network, hop by hop. And I can see here that his local network has a tremendous amount of jitter. So we talked about the scenario of earlier of people being at home, competing with bandwidth with other users that might be in their home, or maybe their home was just never well suited for real-time communication to begin with before they were thrust into their home to work. So we know right away that we're not going to dig into ISP problems. We know it's not a VPN problem. We can see already it's something with Greg's local network. And then we have some of the analytics that were available in the previous screen. We don't need to go back, but we can identify that Greg is using Wi-Fi or wired. What's his signal strength? Some other characteristics about the capabilities of his endpoint is what version of Windows is he running? How much horsepower does it have? A lot of really useful information that can help me understand. Maybe there's some quick fixes here, right? For some organizations that may not be full of very tech-savvy employees, simple solutions like how far are you from your Wi-Fi access point can often make a big difference. And it sounds simple, but we do see and hear about it more than you might think.
Excellent. So I know that you've got a couple of slides, Rob, just to kind of talk a little bit about Martello, and I think it's one or two tops. And why don't you go ahead and do those, and then we've still got about 3 minutes left in our scheduled time, and I know we've got a couple questions that come in the Q&A box. We'll try to see if we can get to some of those. So so with that, I'm going to go ahead and kind of pass the time over to you just to kind of finish up and talk a little bit about Martello, and then we'll try to at least answer a couple questions here.
Perfect. So I guess first, for those of you who may not be aware of Martello, like why Martello? We have a long track record in the unified communication space and delivering call quality analytics and a number of other vendors. Obviously very focused on the Microsoft world now. It's a market recognized solution with global specialists all over the world. Good track record with customer loyalty. Recently accepted into Microsoft's Global Strategic Alliance Program, where Microsoft is working closely with us and bringing us into customers to help those pain points. So that's a great endorsement coming from Microsoft. And then, we've got a couple options here in terms of, you want to learn a little bit more, look at other options. So I included a couple links there. We can just go back one slide. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So Microsoft has some great documentation here on some of the connectivity options that are available. Those are primarily calling plans, direct routing, or operator connect. For those of you who said, I'm looking to move in the next 3 to 6 months, if you haven't already seen those resources, that could be a good resource for you. And there are some other options that you can look at, self-serve options. So, Microsoft has published a PowerShell script that will allow you to test session border controller connection. So if you do have a customer-provided SIP trunk providing traffic to Teams, there's a PowerShell test there, or PowerShell script there that can test, inbound and outbound calls and simultaneous ring and media escalations and things like that. So that could be a useful place for you to start if you want to kind of dig in yourself and a little bit of DIY. That's certainly an option for you. If you prefer to look at the off-the-shelf solution, here at Martello, we'd love to have a conversation with you to understand, what are the pain points you're trying to solve? Is there something that we have in our solution that could be able to help you, some of the things that I talked about today? So, book a demo. We'd love to show you what the solution is that we have, how we can help you with those pain points. We also have a great ebook. So, working in the new normal, how to optimize Microsoft Teams in this new modern workplace. So that would also be a great resource for you guys to check out.
And I'll just leave this slide up. We have a Q&A slide that says questions, and we are at the bottom of the half an hour. So if you do have to head on off to your next meeting, we totally understand. A couple questions have come in from the audience. I do want to try to answer those if we can. So Rob, if it's okay, we'll go on for a couple extra minutes, and if you in the audience have time to stick with us, we'd love for you to do so. So let me go over here. Let's see. So Sebastian is saying, is this so different from any other telephony solution relying on VoIP? And I think he's really talking about Teams and the direct connect. And I'm going to add a little bit, and then Rob, maybe you can answer as well. I just think the difference here, Sebastian, is one, it's integrated with Teams. And then, two, the fact that what we're talking about now, I mean, the other half of that where you're saying and Teams work your existing telephony, from that perspective, probably not. But I think the biggest thing is Microsoft is their drive and their force is to try and put everything into Teams so that you're collaborating, you're communicating, you have, you basically kind of almost live and operate in a lot of ways some portion of, if not all of, in some cases, your business in Teams. And I think that's really the differentiator here is that. I mean, Rob, do you see any difference?
Yeah, I would have said this very similar thing. I agree. It goes well beyond. I mean, the voice and video is the leading part of this, but there are very few solutions that are really driving that deep collaboration through the stack. It's not just a way to chat with each other and have a video call. It goes much deeper than that, as you kind of already talked about.
No, agreed there. Fitzgerald is asking using the call quality dashboard QER using Power BI. And he says they utilize the Teams Admin Center PSTN usage report, and then they use the call quality dashboard QER on Power BI for any other reporting on poor service. So they're wondering what you're using.
Yeah, so we talked to a lot of prospects, but that's where they've started, right? They've used the call quality dashboards. They might have used some of the network connectivity tools that Microsoft provides, and those are definitely great tools to get started. We ingest those same data sources underneath the covers into our solution. We can combine those with a number of other solutions. Some of it is the network diagnostics that I briefly showed a screenshot. So if you want to understand the details of how are users at home or in offices getting to the cloud, all the stuff in between is something that we can monitor and diagnose, include in the same set of data sources. We didn't talk about it much today, but we do have, we've talked in previous webinars about our synthetic transaction capabilities. So we have this concept of robot users that go off and test all the aspects of Microsoft 365 while people are sleeping or busy, looking for problems so that the robot finds the user robot finds the problem before the user does. And our unique piece on top of what Microsoft provides is all those data sources together give you that complete level of visibility to understand, where should I spend my time fixing problems? How do I fix problems? Because I now know where the bottlenecks are. And that differentiates us from what Microsoft provides, and frankly is what, as I mentioned earlier, we work very closely with Microsoft, and they see a lot of value in those extra layers of visibility that they're obviously very interested in making sure their customers are using Teams effectively, and we're a strategic vendor that can make sure that organizations do so.
Yeah, to add to that's funny. I was laughing when you said all that stuff in between. And I laughed like that's really important stuff. If you think about using this like the call quality dashboard type reports, and let's say you run it and you find that all the users that are working from home are really, really slow and having poor quality in their calls. The question is next, what do you do about it? You might go, I don't know, they're at home. I mean, maybe they have bad bandwidth issues, that their Wi-Fi stinks, or right, that kind of thing. And all that stuff in between that you're talking about, that Rob mentioned, is where it becomes really important. Because then if you could try to figure out, well, how are they routing to Office 365? And they have another layer of visibility. You kind of go, oh, I didn't realize they were going all of them through a VPN to the office. And then when I look at the internal routing, what services are involved, oh, they're actually utilizing some kind of security scanning solution that's creating a huge amount of lag, and something along those lines. I mean, it's just additional layers of visibility that really help identify where the problems are for teams overall. And so again, I think you kind of hit on the head, Rob. You said that that report and that dashboard is definitely the first step. And that's where a lot of customers start because they're interested in quality of service, but kind of go farther than that. Sebastian said, thank you for the answer. You're welcome, Sebastian. Kimberly says, how do you translate unclassified calls, Rob?
Unclassified calls.
Need more detail from Kimberly?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one.
Okay, that's fine. So that's not a big deal here. We go. If Kimberly, if you can give us a little more detail here, I'd love to be able to answer the question for you real quick as we can here. So you may not know the answer to this, but Sebastian's asking, Rob, he says, I've learned about Vantage from our sales director. They're their GSX Boston and Amsterdam customers. They said we forecast to deploy teams in PSTN on many locations. Will Vantage help us?
Yes, definitely. So, if you're using Gizmo today, that's that synthetic transaction, that robot user piece that I mentioned, which, a lot of our customers get a lot of value out of. The Vantage piece can provide that organization-wide visibility into where are real users having problems, right? The robots are deployed strategically to try and find problems in different regions, but they don't necessarily mimic every single user. So Vantage will give you that broad coverage across your organization. Where are my problems? It also provides the diagnostics capability, which is the part that Nick was just reinforcing, right? Once we know there's a problem in Nick's home, okay, well, now what? And that's where the diagnostics piece comes in. I'll use my, what stuff in between Nick and the cloud is the bottleneck. And you need the diagnostic piece. And all those pieces work in tandem with our Vantage solution, which we just recently launched.
Yeah, there's one last question. Kimberly hasn't put any more detail in there, so I'm not sure if we're going to get more information on what they're wanting. But Stuart's asking about how can you monitor third-party SBC vendors?
That's a really great question. So that's something we have a little bit of visibility into with our teams called Quality Analytics, and is a big area of an investment for us at the moment. So we are looking at integrating with some of the larger SBC vendors like AudioCodes, Oracle, Ribbon, to be able to pull in data into our analytics engine. So I mentioned the value of having all these discrete data sources that can be brought into to correlate together and give you the full picture. So, today the answer is we've got a little bit of information in the analytics. We are making big investments in this area, so it'd be great to be able to touch base as a follow-up to sort of get some more specifics around that, because as we forge forward that in our R&D labs, it's always good to have some customers involved that are there hand in hand, so they get the sort of feature sets that they're looking for.
And Kimberly came back, and now I understand what she's asking. She's talking about unclassified calls being where Microsoft doesn't have all the jitter or call details. So the original question was, she said, how do you translate them? I think more like, what can you, maybe the question better is just, you've got a call like that doesn't have all the jitter and call detail. What can you tell about that call, Rob?
Yeah, that becomes a bit challenging. So I think in those situations, what we would do is one of two options. We could look at it from a diagnostics probe perspective to see, can we identify any bottlenecks between the user and the team's data center to see, well, even if we don't know that, jitter was high, if we run these tests from the diagnostics perspective and we identify high jitter as your ISP, that might be a good place to start. And the other place might be to actually use our robots, which will synthesize calls on your behalf, and they could identify we measure all these metrics ourselves, and we might be able to get the data that Microsoft's not providing in the case of those calls.
Yeah, and I'll take one more call, and I'm going to probably let class out just because we've been going a little bit. Sebastian is mentioning he likes the idea of maybe having, you mentioned the robots, Rob, but he says running inside a user's PC, which brings the need to manage a very large robot pool. And he says, obviously, this is difficult. And I think that he's thinking about robots a little differently, Rob. I know how they work with Martello, but maybe you could talk about maybe how it's implemented kind of briefly so he understands the difference. I think you can kind of clear that up for him.
Yeah, so typically our customers would not deploy a robot on every endpoint. It is something you could do, not necessarily what our recommendations would necessarily be, where typically most of the problems a robot can find are regional. So, if you've got a cluster of users in France, let's say, and another cluster of users in southeast of the United States, you would put a couple robots in those locations, and the robots will find most issues that might come up in that region, right? A Microsoft outage, ISP poor performance, things like that. The diagnostics probe is the piece that is more endpoint oriented, in which we want that to be on the user's endpoint to understand what is the very specific path that user is taking to the team's data center to understand what's happening.
Yeah, I think I'd also add to that. You mentioned this once before in the middle of the call today. The idea of those bots and that synthetic transaction, Sebastian, is to also hopefully proactively identify that there's a problem in the Paris office early in the morning before anybody actually gets to the Paris office. That's also why it's done as a bot. So that way, instead of it being the user encounters a problem and they go and then they call the help desk and say, we're having an issue with Teams, the IT team already knows there's a problem with Teams before anyone ever gets there. And in theory, to I think where maybe you're going, Sebastian, you're thinking along the lines of maybe how do I know that this particular user is or isn't having a problem? And some of those metrics can be determined just by looking at like call quality dashboards on a per user basis, things like that. And then, I mean, Rob and I've had conversations. It is theoretically possible. Let's say you wanted to monitor the CEO's connectivity and how whether that specific person is functioning well or not. You could, in theory, put like a bot on a VM or something at the CEO's house. I don't know why you would do that, but you could, and you could, in theory, then be monitoring exactly the CEO's house. But obviously, I think to your point in your question, that's not really scalable, and so that's not why it's designed that way. So, anyway, so I think we've got enough here. Let me see. I've got one more thing from Fitzgerald. I don't want to throw past you up because you had a question before. Fitzgerald says the problem is they don't have a single pane of glass tool. They use multiple tools. He names a couple of them. So we just need to check where the problem is just to check for the specific user. And I think that's Rob. That's probably what you're getting at is you're even though you're providing some. I'll use the word duplicative. That's probably not fair, but there is some overlapping functionality that Microsoft already has. But the real value, I think, is you're providing all in one pane of glass in order to see an overarching visibility into every aspect. Would that be accurate?
That's it exactly, right? Like we said before, right? A lot of our prospects or customers start with the call quality dashboard, and they say, okay, well, you also have the call quality data, but why shouldn't I just use the Power BI report? Well, because we can combine that with the diagnostics data, with this robot data. We can pull in third-party systems. So if you're using tools like SolarWinds or System Center or App Dynamics, and you want to get data from those tools, that might also be useful to understand what's happening in an office environment. For example, like I'm in our Ottawa office. There's a bunch of network things between me and the edge of the network here, or the edge of the office here. If those things aren't performing well, then I'm not going to have a good Teams experience. So in that case, the network monitoring tool that we're using can provide me very useful information there. When we put all that together, we can deliver a true end-to-end SLA that tells you, how well are your users using the service. That includes all of those things that we talked about. And then you can automate the workflow. And if you're using something like ServiceNow to track these issues, you can automatically have that flow up into ServiceNow and give visibility to IT, or at least the help desk, on what's going on. Again, back to some of the points we mentioned earlier that a lot of users tend to suffer in silence. Well, now the help desk has better visibility into what's really happening in the organization.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out here. We've done some Q&A here. Is there a thank you slide? There is not a thank you slide. Okay, so then I'll go back one. Actually, no, I won't go back one. We'll leave it there. That's perfect. So, Rob, just want to thank you for a great conversation today. Those of you in the audience, I appreciate your input on the polls. That actually helps to give us an idea of where you're at, and that's really important so that we can make sure as our discussions go on, we're thinking about the context of where each of your organizations there are, because each one of you is different, and it's really hard for us to say, just do this, and that's the answer to the problem, because it's not the same for everybody. And also, thanks for the questions, because those really help make sure we can answer those really well. Rob, any final thoughts before we close things out?
No, I just say thanks, Nick. Love doing these with you, and big thank you to the attendees for taking some time to listen in today. And I would echo the comment on the questions. Love to see some interaction with some great questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. This concludes today's webcast, and we'll catch you on the next one.